So, good morning, class. Today, in the class of botany, we are going to start the topic pollination. So, in last lecture, we already studied about the major reproductive parts of the plant, and in which we have been completed the structure of anther, pollen, and ovule. And after that, we already completed the embryo sac formation. Now, after that, when we got the embryo sac inside the female gametophyte, now, the next process, what is a next lead in the reproductive pattern of a plant, that is pollination. So, today our topic of lecture will be pollination. So, if we're going through about the introduction and overview of this pollination, so as the name suggests, there are transferring of the pollen grains from the male part, that is anther, to the female part, that is stigma. So basically here, transferring of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma take place under the process of pollination. Pollen grains, they are immobiles, okay, means they cannot move by their own. So there are several factors which have to be used for their mobility, or you can say for transferring the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. So this process that can be, you can say, they needed some kind of external help to do that pollination process. So there, they cannot reach the stigma by themselves. So an external agent is required for this. So it can be wind, water, animal, gravity, and growth contact. So this whole process of pollination, it can be done by several agents like the water, help them, animals, or you can say the small insect or some ants like, and the gravity and the growth contact. So these are the things which are basically help pollen to transfer from anther to the stigma. So this is a major objective of the pollination, like they needed to be transferred the pollen from this part to the another part of stigma. So, if we already see what is the pollination, now if we wanted to see what are the types of pollination, so there are two major types of the pollination. The very first is self-pollination and second one is cross-pollination. So what happened inside a self-pollination? As the name suggesting, self means they needed to be do the pollination inside their own flower. Like there in the image, you can see this is an image for a plant A and that is an image for a plant B. So this is a bisexual flower, means both the male and the female part of the plant has to be present inside a flower. So for the self-pollination, this is a very fundamental kind of situation. If the both the part, female part and male part, both the part have to be present inside the flower. So you can simply say that flowers should be bisexual. Now you can see here, these are the anther containing pollen grains. So they are transferring the pollen to their own flower stigma. Okay, so the same flower present here or stigma of a same flower. So that transferring of pollen grain on the stigma of the same flower, that will be known as a self-pollination. Or you can say when the pollen grains pollinated to the same flower in which they are present, they can be called as a, this process or whole mechanism can be known as self-pollination. Now the second one is here cross-pollination. So what happened inside a cross-pollination? You can see there's a plant A and this is a plant B. So now, in this condition, plant B containing anther or having pollen grains, they are transferring to plant A stigma. Okay, now flower have to be different or sometime plant have to be different. Okay, not on the same plant, they can also do the pollination to the different plant also. So that will be called as a cross pollination. Either they are pollinating to the another flower or another plant. So this means total scenario is this, that they should not be present in the same flower. The flower should be different or plant should be different. So that's why when these are having the pollen from a different plant, That process or that kind of pollination will be known as a cross pollination. Next here, there are some classification on the basis of the self-pollination and cross-pollination you can see here. So the broad two categories, self-pollination and the cross-pollination, sometimes also called as xenogamy. Okay, or means this is a second name we can use for the cross-pollination, that is xenogamy. In the self-pollination, there are the two types. First is autogamy and second one is geotogamy. Okay, these are the two types. One self autogamy and then is a geotogamy. Next is here cross pollination or xenogamy. There will be done by the process of cross pollination. In this xenogamy process, that can be done by two agencies. That one is a abiotic agencies and second one is biotic agencies. So what are the differences between the biotic and abiotic component? So basically, biotic things have a life. Okay, the things which are having the you can say the living things normally come under the biotic field. And if we talk about the abiotic components, so these are some atmospheric content which do not have life inside them, like the temperature, sunlight, or wind, water, soil. So these are the abiotic agents or abiotic components. And if we talk about the biotic, like the animals, plants, insect, microbes, they will be come under the biotic component. So in this process of cross pollination, we are going to take the help of two kind of agents. One is the abiotic agents and second one is the biotic agents. So under the abiotic agents, there will be two types. An anemophilic means the pollination will be done by the wind, and second one is here, that is hydrophile. So in that case, as the hydro always suggests for the water, so the pollination will be done by the water. Next here, biotic agencies. In the biotic agencies, that entomophily, that will be done by the insects, chiropterophily, that will be the by bats, malleophily, that will be done by the snails, ornithophily, that will be done by the birds. So these are the different categories under which we can be get help to pollinate our pollen from one flower or one plant to the another plant. Now just take a broad look on the self-pollination. So it is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther of the flower to the stigma of either the same or the genetically similar flower. So genetically similar flower, you can say that it can be the same flower, but this have to be on the same plant. Plant cannot be different. Accordingly, the self-pollination is basically two types. So on the basis of their pollination, there will be like the two types. One is the autogamy and second one is the geotonogamy. Okay, so geotonogamy and autogamy, they are the type of the self-pollination. So autogamy is all about, it's like if we talk about the autogamy in the detail, they have to be like fertilizing the same pollen, or inside the same flower pollen will be inducing inside the same stigma. Okay, so this process will be called as a autogamy process. Now next here, it is a type of self-pollination in which intersexual or perfect flower is pollinated by its own pollen. So they should be pollinated by their own pollen grains. So in this method, you can see here that autogamy, further if we classify them, they will be like two types, homogamy and clustergamy. So in the homogamy, the anther and the stigma of chasmogamous or open flower and brought together by growth, bending and folding. So here this homogamy, so like they are having inside the same flower, so that's why the flower needed to be open. It cannot be closed. Anther and stigma, though both have to be open and brought together by their growth when they are growing further and developmental process have been take place in a developing manner. So that's why when the stage come to the reproduction pad, they will be bent on each other. So due to having this bending formation inside the flower, the pollen can easily drop off on the stigma of the same flower. Next is the clusterogamy. So in clusterogamy flower, the anthers descends inside the closed flower and the growth of style of pollen grain in contact with the stigma. So basically, what happened in the clusterogamy flower? The anther descends inside the closed flower. Now, what are the major differences in between them? That one flower has to be open and second flower has to be closed. So clusterogamy will be happen inside the closed flower. So growth of the style brings the pollen grain in contact with the stigma and the pollination and the seed sets are assured. So this pollination are based pollinators are not required in this kind of pollination. So that's obvious when the flower have to be same and they are close with each other and they are very closely present and intact. So that's why in that case pollinators are not required at all. So clusterogamy is a phenomena that can be done by automatically inside a closed flower. Next here, you can see the in that diagram the all the things which I explained you that are present here in a diagrammatic representation. Like the self-pollination, this is a open flower and a pistil of the same flower contact the pollen. The same flower contacting the pollen with the same stigma. So this kind of formation and pollen come loose from the stamen. So basically, they are just drop off on the style of the stem. So next here, that is called the geotenogamy. So in the process of the geotenogamy, this is a type of pollination. It's when pollen grains of the one flower have to be transferred to the stigma of the another flower. So now the plant will be the same in the condition. Okay, plant do not have to be changed, but what is going to be changed here? That is the flower. So the same plant will be taking place in the pollination, but what will be going to be different? The difference will be come under the flower condition. Now you can see the flower that is a genetically same flowers. The same type of pattern is seen here. So the pollen grain of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower belonging to either the same plant or genetically similar plant. So this is the condition here. The plant should be same or either they should be identical in the genetic makeup. So that's why this is called the geotenogamy. So the geotenogamy is all about the genetically stable plant having the pollination. So in geotenogamy, the flower often show modifications similar to one found in the xenogamy or cross-pollination. So sometimes they can be show the modification also, like they should be pollinated like the cross-pollination. So the xenogamy, they will be like the cross-pollination, but it happen only under certain modification. In the normal condition of the deuteronogamy, they cannot be pollinated through the normal autogamy process, but this have to be present in the same plant. But this phenomena, some scientists and some advisors take this phenomena that they said that this can be come under the xenogamy or the cross pollination. So now we have to see what are the advantages and disadvantages of the self-pollination process. So let's go with the first the advantages of the self-pollination. So first, if we talk about the advantages, So they maintain the parental characteristic or purity of the race indefinitely. So basically, when there are no mixing up of any genetic makeup, so that's why they are maintaining the characteristic throughout their ancestral to the modern things. That's why they are having the same kind of character which has been present in their parents will be followed to their offsprings. Next year, the self-pollination is used to maintain pure line of hybridization and experiment. So basically, when we are having the pure line structures, so pure line structure is greatly influenced in the hybridization experiment, because when we are going to do the hybridization process, that is all about mixing of a best characters. So the mixing of the best characters, that will be going to lead only by the pure line investment. Now, the plant does not need to produce large number of pollen grains, so quantity of the pollen grain should can be limited because they just have to pollinate it in the same flower. So they do not need any kind of vast quantity of pollen which have to be transferred some another plant. Next year, flower do not develop devices for attracting insect pollinator. So they do not to be very attractive, not colorful. They do not need any kind of very effective odor. So basically, these type of things that cannot be, if not be present inside a plant or flower, then also still they can make the pollination happen. Now, if we see the disadvantages of the self pollination, like everything which are having the advantages, also they are having the disadvantages. Like the new useful character are seldom introduced. So, basically, new useful characters which can be introduced by the crossing of new genotypes that have a less to be here. Vigor and vitality of the race decreased with prolonged self pollination. So, vigor and vitality. Vigor only can be made when the two cross lines have to be interbreed, or you can say they breeded in a cross lines, then only we are having the vigor. So, basically, this vigor qualities has to be decreased in the self pollination, and they prolonged self-pollinators. So that's why this can be a huge loss. Immunity to disease decrease. The immunity which have to be developed by several mutations in the plant, that can also be decreased in the case of self-pollination. Adaptability to change environment are reduced. So plants have a huge adaptation quality, but these adaptation only work when they get mutated. So every time when an adaptation have to be introduced inside a plant, they need it to be mutated. But if they are not going to going the process through the mixing, or you can say the intermixing of a breed of new genetics, so at that case they cannot be fully functional for any kind of adaptation. Next here, the cross pollination. So the cross pollination, that is also very important, and they are having the huge role to play inside the pollination. So the basically when we are talking about the cross pollination, in this the transfer of pollen grain from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a genetically different flower. So this is a key term you have to be remember. Then when the pollen grain transferring from a flower to the another flower. So in that case, that another flower should be genetically different. Okay, they cannot be genetically similar. So the cross pollination is performed with the help of an external agency. But in this process, like as we talked about in self pollination, they do not need any kind of external agents. But in the case of the cross pollination, they are going to have help from the external agencies to transfer the pollen from one flower to the another flower. Now, what are the agency for the pollination inside the cross pollination? So first you can say here the abiotic agencies and the biotic agency. We already talked about the what is abiotic component and what are the biotic components. So let's just skip to this part and come to the agencies. So this is the first thing is here, that is a anemophily. Okay, the name anemophily, that is considered for the pollination or transfer of pollen grains via wind. So what are the agents here? Wind is the agent in the kind of pollination, and that is called anemophily. So anemophily is a basically a kind of mutation which are going to need the help of the wind. Like there are some plants which go abundantly through the anemophily type of pollination. That is the coconut, palm, date, maize, many grasses, cannabis. So these are the very abundantly plants which have to perform the cross pollination, and their agents are wind. Now, what are the characteristic of this kind of pollination? So the flower are colorless, odorless, and nectarless. So basically, wind do not need any kind of color, odor, or nectar to transfer the pollen. Pollen grains are light, should be light, small, winged, dusty, dry, smooth, non-sticky, and unwettable. But there are more characters as comparison to color, order, nectar. Like what are the character? What are the characters which has to be present in that inside the anemophilic? That are they should be light, because if they are not light, wind cannot carry them. They should be small. They have to be wing, because if they do not wing, they cannot fly. They should be dusty. Dust can easily be transferred by the wind, so they should be dusty. They should be dry. Okay, some sticky thing, some liquid thing cannot be drawn by the wind. So that's why they should be non-sticky, dry, and unwettable. Third one is stigma is hairy, feathery, or branch to catch the wind-borne pollen grains. Now the third thing is about the stigma here, the catchy portion. So this stigma that should be hairy for getting the pollen, or sometimes that can be feathery or branch. So ultimately it should be boring one, like means which can catch the pollen from the wind. Pollen grains are produced in very large number, so the pollen transfer via this wind formation, sorry, via this wind transportation, that is very huge in number or large in number. Even you can say that there are a large number of the pollen grains that can be transferred via the wind in a maize plant. Wind pollinators, you can see here how dusty, smooth they are looking, very tiny and very stabilizedly dry. You can see the stigma here. Stigma is also feathery or versatile, so that's why easily they can catch any kind of pollen which is transferring through the wind. Second one is the second type of the agents which are going to used under the cross pollination, that are the hydrophils. So in this mode, what happen? Pollinator or transfer of pollen grains through the agency of water. Now, water will be going to use for the transfer of the pollen grain. Most of the time, this kind of character or this kind of pollination abundantly see in the hydrophytes plant. Because in the hydrophytes plant, water is a largest medium to transfer anything from one plant to another plant. So, like example, Geostera and Valsinaria, these both two plants which have a very abundant quality for the pollination by water. Now, what are the characteristics which come under the hydrophily? That are flowers are small, inconspicuous. Okay, flowers should be small and they should be inconspicuous. Nectar and odor are absent. There is no use for the nectar and odor. Pollen grain are light and unwettable due to presence of mucilage cover. So pollen should be lighted as was required in wind, and unwettable because wetting of the pollen that can destroy their internal material. So that's why every hydrophytes they are having this mucilage canals in them. So basically mucilage canals help them to decaying or undecaying their process. So that's why this undecay process have to be done inside the pollen also, and hence they should need the mucilage cover around them. Stigma is long, sticky but unwettable. Stigma also should be long, should be sticky, but unwettable. Should not be wettable. Means they should also be dry. In the diagram, you can see the characteristics of a hydrophilic. This is the stigma of the female flower, ripe anther, the male flower, and how they are going from the help of water. These are the pollen which are carrying by the water to the another female flower. and here the stigma of the another female flower, and these pollen are going to replace this pollen to these female flower, and the pollination will be take place. Here you can see this is the Pinodali in the Wilson area, and this is a hydrotrophily, like the male flower. And this simply they are going to the like they have some kind of swim capacity that they can be swim under the water, and hence you can say they are having this large and long type of stigma on their flower. So easily they can just adjust it inside their stick. Third is here entomophily. So entomophily, as the name suggests, the pollen grains are transferred to mature through the agency of insects. So entomophily is all about transferring of pollen grains by the insects, like moths, butterfly, wasps, bees, beetle. So these are the plants which are going to help us, and there are many angiospermic plants or any plant which look beautiful that can transfer the pollen through this agency of insect, like the sunflower, marigold. These are the flowers which have a very wide tendency of the cross pollination via insects. So what are the characteristics which have to be required for the entomophily? First is they showy or brightly colored. They are needy ones. So that's why they need a very bright and beautiful color petals, and they should be very large sometime. Most insect pollinated flower have a landiform platform. So this landing platform should be needed like this. This is a landing platform on which this bee is presenting on that. So this platform is to be needed for their landing, and because they needed to be take nectar, so it will take some time. And while they are taking the nectar, the pollen grain, the sticky pollen grains, they should be present here. So they just attach to their legs when they go to another flower. When they just land there, so they easily drop off these pollen on the another plant. So another flower or another stigma. So the pollen grain are spiny, heavy, and surrounded by a yellow, oily, sticky substance called pollen kit. So basically, in this case, pollen have to be surrounded by a very sticky component that has to be called the pollen kit. Stigma are often inserted and sticky. A stigma also should be inserted, present inside, not the outside, like in the entomophily or in the hydrophily or anemophily. It should be inserted inside. Some flower provide safe place to insect for laying eggs, and some of the flower even having a certain places in what insect can lay their eggs, like the plant of yucca, that have a specific range or specific surface for laying the eggs of insects. You can see the diagram here, how at the range in the pollen grains these bees are coming, and basically these bees, or you can say honeybee, they are having a very huge range for the cross pollination, or you can say a large number of the pollination can be done by the help of bees. Next is here ornithophily. So ornithophily is all about birds. So when the transportation of the pollen from one place to another place has been taken by the birds, that will be called as the ornithophily. So you can say it is a mode of allogamy performed by the bird. Only a few type of birds are specialized for this. They usually have a small size but long beaks. So not all the birds can do this allogamy process or transferring of pollen from one place to another place. A special kind of the birds will be needed to do this kind of function. Like the birds have to be small in size, but their beak should be long. And another characteristic which can be helpful in the orthinophily process, that is very first is the flower are usually brightly colored, right? Red, orange, yellow, and blue. So mostly the red and orange color they get attract the birds. The floral part are commonly leathery. Most of the part which have to be soft and leathery, means the petals they should be a little more thick, leathery in texture. The orthinophilous flowers secrete abundant watery nectar or have edible parts. So basically, this flower they should have some edible parts. So basically, why the birds have to come there? Because they need to eat something, and if they do not get anything to eat, they won't come that place. So that's why this flower have to be present, or they have to be take some part in the edible as a edible part, so they can come and eat. And while they are eating, some pollen grains are basically stick to their beak, and when they go to another plant and start eating again, so at that time they lose some pollen at that place. So in that manner we can easily see how the pollen can be transferred from one place to another place. Sense is often absent, so they are not very fond for any kind of nectar, so nectars is not very important here. Now, the methods of ensure cross pollination. So, some of other methods, which these were the agents, now these are the methods which are going to ensure the cross pollination. The very first here, dichogamy. So, in what happened in the case of dichogamy, let's take by the definition. Anther and stigma mature at different time in a bisexual flower so as to prevent self pollination. So, what can lead to cross pollination? If the stigma and anther, if they get mature at the same time in a bisexual flower, what will happen? They will be fused, they will be fertilized by the same anther pollen. So, that happen, that lead to the self pollination. But if they are going to develop or mature at the different time period, or their maturity has some differences, so at that time they will lead to the cross pollination. Second is protandry, means anther mature earlier than stigma of the same flower. Their pollen grains become available to the stigma of the older flower, like the sunflower or salvia. So basically, what happened here? Anther mature very early. Okay, then the stigma didn't ready yet, but anther matures early. So they can fertilize the same flower but the older stigma. Okay, not the new stigma. So their pollen grain become available to the stigma of older flower. So at that time, when the anther develop first, that is called protandry. Now the protagony and that stigma mature earlier so that they get pollinated before the anther of the same flower develop the pollen grain. So this can be the process protandry, anther develop first and stigma develop later. Protagony, in which stigma will going to be developed earlier and the pollen will be developed later. So this is a process that can become under the, or they can lead to the cross pollination. Next here, hergogamy. So in some bisexual flower, the structure of male and female sex organs itself prove a barrier to the self-pollination. You can see here what happened, they just adjusted in a way that the same flower pollen cannot be dropped on the same flower stigma. Like if we are talking about, this is a long style and the short stamen filament, if their stamen are here, so or it's very obvious the stamen have to fall off the pollen grain. So how they can fall off the pollen grain of this on this plant or this stigma, because this is very above to that pollen. So this above pollen, so that pollen cannot be reached to the top. So that's why at that time what happened, or sometimes that can be opposite, like the long stamen filament and very short style. So this also can happen in the hergogamy, that they cannot going to lead for the self pollination. Alternatively, they have to go for the cross pollination. Self sterility or self incompatibility. Sometimes what happens, some of the pollen grain of flower do not germinate on the stigma of same flower due to presence of similar self sterile genes. So some type of sterile genes are also present, because flower have two kind of part, one is a sterile part, one is a fertile part. So sometimes due to having the same kind of sterile genes, they cannot get fertilized. Heterostyly, sometimes the heterostyly, like there are two or three type of flower with different height of style and stamen. So this can also lead to the cross pollination. How? Like the dimorphic heterostyly, means there are two type of flower: pin-eyed, long style and short stamen; thumb-eyed, short style and long stamen. This is the same which I already told you inside this diagram. So this process, that one, and this stamen is Style is long and stamen is short, that is called pentai, and thronite, in which short style and long stem. Next here, that is called triheterostyly, means there are three type of flower with different height of style. You can see here every three different type of flower, and they are having a different kind of the height of their styles, in which their middle one is very highest and this middle one is very lowest. In this both four will be same, but the style is very low. So this kind of the thing which in which the same flower, in which the same plant, three kind of the flower will be formed. So obviously that thing cannot lead to the self pollination. Now the artificial pollination that also happen inside. Now we want some kind of plant to introduce, have some specific features. If we want features of our own interest, at that time what we do the artificial pollination. So this technique is used for the purpose of hybridization. Basically, if we want some better character from their parents, so then we are going to the artificial pollination. So it involves pollination of desired female parent with pollen from the desired male parent, taking all precautions to prevent contamination of stigma with undesired pollination. So here we have to take so many step, or you can say so many aesthetic conditions, in which we have to be very controlled environment should be provided for the artificial pollination, because any kind of disturbance can lead to a unsuccessful product formation. So that's why the two process that take place in bisexual flower for keeping up that is emasculation or bagging. The stigma and anther are the same. They just cut out this, or sometimes they just, by the help of a brush, they can just point out the pollen of a special flower, which character they want inside of some another plant, and they just put that pollen transfer by this pen. And but in that case, they have to remove the original pollen of that particular flower. Means a flower which are having both the things, anther and stigma, just remove the anther and just polish the pollen which you wanted to be character inside the flower. So this can be artificially done. So now what are the importance of the cross pollination? So there are several advantages and disadvantages. Like the advantages, cross pollination introduce genetic recombination and hence variation in the progeny. So we can get a variety or diversity under the condition of cross pollination. A different kind of character can be introduced. Cross pollination increase adaptability of the offspring towards change in the environment. So they make the plant more adaptable. So they can face any kind of uneven situations also, because they are having the crops of several other plants. So that's why their adaptation quality has been increased. It makes the organism better fitted in the struggle for existence. So when the Darwin's theory of survival of fittest will be going to be applied, then they are having the more potential as compared to self-pollinated plants. The plants produced those cross-pollination are more resistant to disease. Also, they are having the more kind of gene flow inside them. So hence they are having the more potential for fighting with the disease. What are the disadvantages? So everything which have some advantages also going through with the some disadvantages. So what are disadvantages here? A factor of chance is always, like sometimes they can be involved a bad kind of gene also. Not always they are getting good. Sometimes it's also happen that they are getting some gene which is responsible for any kind of disease formation. Involved in cross pollination, it is less economical. So that is not very economical, because any kind of mutation will be basically disrupt our product or our imagination of product. So that's why it is less economical, that is more environmental. Some undesirable character can become, because some this is not an isolated thing, not a very you can say controlled version. So that's why anything can be happen inside this. This is not predictable, these are totally unpredictable. The very good characteristic of the race are likely to be spoiled, but sometime what happen, the very good character of the one ancestral plant that can be replaced by the character of another plant. So that can also be happen inside the cross pollination. So this is all about the cross pollination or the self pollination. There is another term here, co-evaluation of flower and its pollinator species. So basically, what is this co-evolution? It is the evolution in two species that interact extensively with one another, so that each act as a major force of natural selection on the other. So when we evolve as a new feature or modify itself, the other involve new adaptation in response to it. So basically, when till a very long time, if two another species plant are crossing over with each other, so most of the features of both the things will be, you can say, will be mutated in them, or adaptation quality for both the things will be increased. So this kind of evolution, which is going to involve in the genetic flow of two species together for a very long time, that is called the co-evolution, or you can say the mutation happens inside the two species for a long time, because they're evoluting over the time, they are mutating over the time. So that's why we are called them the co-evolution. So the co-evolution of flower and its pollinator species are tightly linked with one another. So obviously that the co-evolution inside a flower, and that was designed by some pollinators, so they have to be tightly linked with each other. It was all about the pollination. I think you are going to answer these questions very efficiently now. The flower have small pollen grains are pollinated by. Type of pollination include considering the wind pollinated and insect pollinated flower, the flower that are pollinated by wind. Okay. The example of flower that are pollinated by wind are, so which one of them can be pollinated by wind? And the flower that have bright color pattern rather than the dull petal are pollinated by. So that is very easy, because some of them are just restricted to the dry bright color petal flowers, and only they can be responsible for their pollination. So I think you all got the knowledge about how the pollination work, what are their types, and what are the agents which are going to help in the pollination. But still, if you have some problem, if you wanted to go through again or wanted some more knowledge, you can go through these references. They will definitely going to help you, because there are a very broad spectra in these. Like the second one, March JD 2008 edition, that is very good. Botany and Introduction to the Plant Biology. So in that you will going to have a lot about the flowering plants. So this is all about today. Thank you. Still, if you guys have any problem, just message me.